Good morning. So here we are. It is nearly 10 years to the day since we first learned that the big banks were crashing the American economy. Instead of learning from the lessons of the 2008 crash, Congress is getting ready to pass the biggest financial deregulation bill in decades. And I want to talk today about three ways that that's dangerous. First, this bill hurts consumers. It makes it easier for banks, once again, to offer risky home loans to consumers that can't afford them. Leading up to the 2008 crisis, banks were selling mortgages that were like grenades with the pins pulled out. And now the supporters of the bill want to strip back some of the rules designed to stop that from happening all over again. This bill also undermines civil rights protections. At a time when lending discrimination is running rampant, this bill would undercut reporting requirements that enable the federal government to enforce fair lending laws. The bill makes it easier to cheat people who purchase manufactured homes. And the bill lets lenders make lives a lot more miserable for one reason only, so that lenders can make bigger profits. Second, in addition to hurting consumers directly, this deregulatory bill puts our entire economy at risk. It takes banks with up to $250 billion in assets. That's about 25 of the 40 largest banks in the country off the watch list for more federal oversight. These are the same banks that got nearly $50 billion in taxpayer bailout money during the crash, and no one went to jail. Remember Countrywide? Countrywide was the bank that was at the heart of the crash. At its peak, Countrywide was issuing 1 out of every 5 mortgages in the country. And you know what those mortgages did. Those were the mortgages with the teaser rates. Those were the mortgages with all the tricks and traps built into the fine print. And those are the mortgages that helped blow up the financial system. You know how big Countrywide was when it was creating all this risk in the financial system? It was about $200 billion, which is smaller than some of the banks that would be deregulated by this bill. If this bill passes, the next Countrywide will be regulated as if it were some tiny little community bank. That's staggeringly dangerous for the American economy. In fact, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released its score of the bill just last night, and the CBO found that the bill would increase the chances of a big bank failing, that it would put taxpayers on the hook for millions in additional costs. According to the CBO, this bill increases the chances of another bailout. Third, I want to highlight a provision in this bill that hasn't gotten much attention in the last few weeks, but it literally applies only to the dozen biggest banks in the country, including JP Morgan and Citi. The bill changes just one word. It says the Fed shall tailor the rules for the biggest banks instead of may tailor the rules. Now, that one word change will allow the big banks to sue the Fed if they don't weaken the rules the way the banks want. And that pressure on the Fed will lead to a systematic weakening of the rules for all the big banks. This may be the single most dangerous provision in the bill, and it applies only to the biggest Wall Street banks. Now, the proponents of this bill say, no, that word change won't have any effect at all. Really? If that's so, then why not take it out? Why make the change at all? And the reason, of course, is that the big banks want the change because they believe it will help them. And this bill is all about helping big banks. The bill's going to be on the Senate floor this week. I'm going to fight back. Starting today and over the next few days, I'm going to give a series of speeches on the floor to highlight the threat posed by this bill. Today, I'm going to explain ways in which the bill will directly harm consumers, Tomorrow, I'm going to focus on the big banks that stand to win big if this bill passes, and talk about their destructive behavior, both before and after the 2008 crisis. And finally, on Thursday, I'm going to talk some about the history of deregulation efforts in Congress, because we've seen this movie before and we know how it ends. I'm going to keep pushing for changes in the legislation. I have more than a dozen amendments ready to go. Some will show what real consumer protection looks like my bill to impose mandatory penalties on companies like Equifax when they lose consumer data, and my bill to prohibit employers from requesting credit reports as part of a job application process. Other amendments will demonstrate serious flaws in the bill, like my amendment which would prohibit rolling back the rules on any big bank that got more than $1 billion in bailout money during the last crash. The way I see it is that people in this building may forget the devastating impact of the financial crisis 10 years ago, but the American people have not forgotten. The American people remember the millions of people who lost their homes, the millions of people who lost their jobs, the millions of people who lost their savings. They remember, and they do not want to turn loose the big banks again. Congress should listen to the American people and refuse to pass this bill. And I'm glad to take whatever questions you have. Yes?
Senator, 11 of your Democratic colleagues support the bill, and they say that it's going to help community banks. You said that, you mentioned Countrywide, for example. Is there any significant change, or any threshold you would be able to support, or an amendment that, as you mentioned, with $1 billion going to any of these folks who receive bailout money, would they be exempt? Could you just elaborate on what you'd be willing to support in terms of a threshold? And secondly, is there anything you can do to actually stop this bill from moving forward from a procedural standpoint?
So let me start with your question about community banks. And let me make a point that's clear. I understand. Some people stand up and say, oh, but this might have some provisions in it that would be helpful for community banks. If this bill were only about community banks, we'd be having an entirely different conversation. There wasn't a divide. It's not as if Democrats said, let's help community banks, and Republicans said, no, let's not help community banks. We had some consensus to try to help community banks. The problem was over adding provisions to this bill that help giant banks. A bank that is $250 billion is not a community bank, and it should not be regulated like a community bank. To do that is extraordinarily dangerous for the economy. So that's the first part about the community banks. On the question of what we can do, I'm doing exactly the best I can, and that is to get out and talk to the American people about it. People in Congress may have forgotten the crash 10 years ago, but I guarantee that people across this country have not forgotten the pain that these giant banks caused, and they do not want to see Congress move toward deregulating these banks. Yes?
Given that, why do you think there's so much Democratic support? Several members of the banking committee who are, as you know, steeped in these issues as you are, Mark Warner, who was involved in drafting Dodd-Frank. Why do you think there's the amount of Democratic support?
There's Democratic and Republican support because the lobbyists have been pushing since the first day Dodd-Frank passed to weaken the regulations on these giant banks. Remember, back during the crash, the giant banks were spending more than $1 million a day to fight against sensible regulations that would keep them from crashing the economy. And we got those regulations ultimately in place, and they have worked. And it's not as if the banks are suffering. Today, the big financial institutions are making record profits. And yet, they spend some of their money to fund herds of lobbyists to thunder through the halls of Congress, demanding that regulations be weakened for these financial institutions. They think they can juice their profits if they can get Congress to just turn down the regulations. It's a demonstration of what's wrong with Washington. The lobbyists speak loud here, but the people don't. Yeah.
I mean, you highlighted the swaps push-out repeal in
Yep.
2014, and then these same Democrats started negotiating this bill that's on the floor now. I mean, when will the tide turn? I mean, how frustrated are you that you just keep highlighting this and it keeps happening?
Look, I'm enormously frustrated on behalf of the American people. The American people are the ones who paid the huge price when the economy crashed. We all watched what happened. The banks made the big profits in the run-up to the crash, and then got bailed out. Nobody went to jail, but people across this country suffered. Millions of people lost their homes, millions of people lost their jobs, millions of people lost their savings. And they call on Congress to act on behalf of the American people, not to act on behalf of giant financial institutions. All I know to do is to stand up and keep talking about this issue, to put as many amendments as I can forward, to point to the new Congressional Budget Office score that says this bill will increase the likelihood that American taxpayers will be on the hook for another bailout. I don't understand how anyone, regardless of political party, could support a bill like that. That means the American taxpayer is going to take all the risk and all the profits are going to go to giant banks. That's just fundamentally wrong. Yes?
I know we're talking about Dodd-Frank, but I interviewed the president of the Consumer Bankers Association this week, who said that next up for them is changing the structure of the CFPB. So after this happens, I mean,
What could possibly go wrong? Yeah.
But after this happens, I guess, what can you do, I guess, to unify the Democratic Party, to Zach's question, about getting everyone on the same page?
But this does go back to Zach's question. That's the importance of fighting now. The importance of fighting now is to stop this bill. But it's also to make clear we're not just going to lay down for the big financial institutions. We're not going to say to the banks, come do whatever you want. We're here because of the people who elected us. And we're supposed to be doing the people's business, not the business of the big banks. Yeah.
Do you worry that some of your critiques here could be used against your Democratic colleagues? A bunch of these folks are up for election in November.
Look, all I know is how the American people feel about bank deregulation. And telling a bank that's $250 billion that it can be regulated the same way as some tiny little local community bank makes no sense at all. And everyone who votes for this bill has to acknowledge that truth. Yeah.
Do you think your leadership and Senator Schumer specifically is doing enough to defeat the bill, or at least give you opportunities to vote on this amendment?
Right. This is a big issue right now, whether or not the Republicans will give us amendments, and if so, how many? I want an open amendment process. Democrats have been asking for an open amendment process now for years on one bill after another. I note that this is exactly what Mitch McConnell demanded back when the Democrats were in the majority. He wanted to see an open amendment process. I want to be able to get some amendments on the table, both the kind of amendments that demonstrate how we could make changes in the law that would help American families. You know, we could respond to the Equifax debacle by actually passing some laws that would help consumers. And we could take some of the worst provisions out of this bill. For example, I have an amendment that I want to propose that says any bank that got more than $1 billion in taxpayer money can't be deregulated. I think that's a good amendment, and I'd like to see my colleagues vote on that. So I hope we'll get a chance to vote on amendments on this, but boy, I'm going to keep pushing for it. Yes?
Yesterday, 87 people around the Capitol were arrested protesting the expiring DACA deadline.
Yes.
So the deadline has passed.
Yeah. I've been posting stories nearly every day about dreamers from Massachusetts. These are real people whose lives are on the line. They need to keep fighting, and we need to keep fighting alongside them.
Last question.
Yeah.
Senator Warren, when President Trump came into office, he pledged to mostly repeal Dodd-Frank. House Republicans passed a bill that would largely replace it. This is a more modest piece of legislation. So would you say that you've been successful in defending the bill threat? The law.
Right. I don't want to see any rollback of banking regulations that puts American consumers at greater risk. Congress should be imposing greater restrictions on financial companies that break the law. Equifax, for example, may actually make money off its breach of consumer data. That's just wrong. We need to change the laws around that. Consumers need more control over their financial data. And companies like Equifax, who don't take enough care in protecting people's data, should have to pay penalties when breaches occur. There are changes we could be making in Congress, but it's not to roll back the regulations. It's to see the places where the regulations weren't enough and to strengthen them. We're not here to do the bidding of giant Wall Street banks. We're here to do the bidding of the American people.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you all. Thank you for being here. Good.